Hello, everyone.
G'day and welcome to Fractal Sovereignty. Firstly, I'd like to just say that we are working on getting some more regular podcasts out. We'll be getting some more out over the coming weeks. Belinda and myself will be attending the Holochain intensive on the Sunshine Coast. So I hope to get a bit of content up there as well. And yeah, let's just get into it. So today I've got Colin Stewart from Producers Token. How's it going, mate?
It's going very well. Very well. Thank you. Happy to be here.
Mate. So I got talking to Colin when I was wanting to learn more about how I could help support them and myself through the development of my farm. So I mentioned in previous podcasts that we're looking to get the bees going and flowers and mushrooms up on my farm. And I just wanted to know more details about how I could be one of the leading producers on what they're doing, how I could start developing my farm in alignment with what they're doing, how I could get involved, what the financial model would likely look like, and just how I could best prepare myself in general. And since then, Colin and me and also Belinda have had some magnificent chats actually. And Colin's someone who I feel like we can just talk about the grand vision of Scepter and metacurrency and how it all works together. So yeah, it's great to have you on, mate. So tell everyone like who you are and how you are here today with producers and with yourself and with Holochain.
Yeah, so I am the Director of Agricultural Technology for Producers Market. And really simply, Producers Market is a company and platform for connecting agricultural producers, people in the agricultural value chain more directly and efficiently than what we have now. At Producers, we really like to take a kind of like a historical view or contextualize our marketplace and history. The agricultural industry has long been dominated by a pattern that has subjected farmers, agriculturalists, cultures, peoples who root their a lot of identity and being into what they produce from the ground, and really creating negative patterns that disempower them. So we really like to look at kind of the history of business and how really the patterns of imperialism have created now in a global agricultural economy that doesn't respect really who produces our food first, producers. So we're really working to shift the model from a buyer's market to a producer's market. So we look at how we can incorporate modern technological tools to really simply connect buyers and sellers and consumers, being people, more directly to the value chain into their food. So that really looks like a marketplace called producersmarket.com that uses storytelling, modern distributed ledger technology tools, Holochain, digital marketing suites of services to kind of aggregate these into a simple toolkit and very simple user experience and user interface so farmers can tell their stories. And for me, this pattern really fits into the broader meme happening in maybe what we can call the peer-to-peer internet, or how Holochain speaks about it from a data-centric model where data is the oil or the oxygen of this economy, to a more agent-centric model that places the power of people in control over our data, over our financial transactions, over our food, over our journalism with and really the kind of the more meat, the more juicy part of, I think, this theme is, we again have had negative patterns of businesses that have externalized true value for sake of pure profit, or for sake of external companies that actually don't support the communities that are engaging with services or products. And so that's a little bit about how we contextualize it. And I think, what we've connected about before is like, really, these are global themes. And I think really what we're talking about is the peer-to-peer movement. So what are the corporate structures? What are the organizational structures that arise from kind of the dissolution or disincorporation of really 500-year-old corporate models? Especially agriculture, it's a great context. The first publicly listed company was the Dutch East India Company. And they really kind of set the stage for how stocks are issued and shares are issued. And they really built their whole model around control and conquest of natural resources, reselling them for profit. And the argument is really that pattern has manifested in every single industry. And really, it's now, I'd argue, consolidated in the internet economy with the big four right now. They all kind of take our data and then sell it for free, sell it for a fee. And so there's no reciprocity built in, and people are starting to, I think, become more aware that this is it's a problem, right? We're seeing these huge proliferation of mega powerful companies that also don't profit share very well. And B, there's also just a realization that the patterns that we can hard code into our technical systems and our community systems can kind of buck that trend. And a phrase I really like is inverted firm. So we kind of, at producers, we see ourselves as inverted firms. I see Hum as the same. And inverted firm is really just simply the idea of Uber, right? Uber's the largest taxi company in the world, but they don't own taxis. Or Airbnb is the largest hotel company in the world, but they don't own hotels. Producers, we're looking to invert that firm to really be, producer centric. And that really what I see in the future is, how do we get these inverted firms who are operating more equitable peer-to-peer systems to network, to deliver better services, to be realistic about how the systems right now are eroding our economy and our ecology, and how we create more human-led systems, producer-led.
Yeah, beautiful. There's quite a lot there, so let's see if we can unpack a little bit of that. In regards to those patterns that you mentioned, like the old patterns and then the new patterns that are being created, what do you think is required from the people within this ecosystem? Like, what shift in either their thinking or their behavior do you think is either necessary or maybe encouraged to begin to facilitate and to work in this environment?
Great question. A lot of it for me comes down to design, how we engage with systems. I take the example of Instagram. Instagram had an incredible design, super fun to use. It was easy to use. It kind of comes down to twofold. It's an incentive structure, and it's also what the convenience is of the platform. By this ecosystem, do you mean specifically within Holochain or within producers, or?
Just take it wherever you want, but I guess, like from your experience in producers, but I guess I am talking more broadly with Holochain. But we can use your example of producers. Like, for example, if I'm a farmer and I want to get involved, what do I need to shift within me and the way that I go about my operations, or the way that I think about the farming or agricultural business, or the way that I sell my product, or the way in which I'm creating something for the people that are going to consume it?
Yeah, so producers has found market fit because to sell or trade your agricultural products is something producers already do. It's just that the agricultural industry has been slow to move over to the interweb. So there's a lot of paper moving a lot of old checks, a lot of net 30, net 60 terms. And for us, kind of what I was hearkening back to is the design has to be so easy that it's easy for people to engage with. So farmers or producers can just get on a smartphone app and say, hey, look, this is me, this is my story, this is what I grow, and I can just list it, what I have available. So then if I'm a buyer or a food eater, a person looking to buy food, I can easily pull up the Producers Market app and look through the producers and be like, hey, look, I'm in Queensland, or right, I'm in it wherever, and I can access that farmer. So for us, it's, we might have some like very interesting technology in the back end, but it actually doesn't really matter what's happening as long as it's usable and actually includes and enhances the farmer's life or the food buyer's, the consumer's life. Ease of use, and also creating an ecosystem that allows people to engage in patterns that are actually more effective and efficient. I like to think of it as there's really nothing stopping us. I'm going to take a kind of North American centric view right now because that's where I am right now. But there's nothing stopping us from buying, let's say nuts directly from a nut farmer. Like it's actually quite a better deal because it's wholesale, it's tax-free. You don't have taxes on foods, right? The only thing stopping us is the distribution and the patterns of processing and packing. But to actually make that physical link and that payment directly to the farmer is actually a much better deal for both ends because the farmer isn't paying someone to basically brand it for themselves. So it's really just it's not really huge shifts. It's just making the value flows more visible in the system. So this is kind of how we get into the Holochain philosophy of currency design, currency creation. Is really just making the value flows in a supply chain. We call them value chains or value systems more visible so we can basically deliver a more efficient, productive, and healthy ecosystem of really food and land systems.
Yeah. And so when those value chains are more visible and the currency and the technology is designed in the way that you just mentioned, do you see any steps happening after that from the behaviors or the way in which people interact? Like, for example, maybe I'm not, shift from having a monoculture to having many crops or cycling through, or maybe there's a way to plan 3 or 5 years in advance because people are demanding something, and I know that through a mutual credit currency, people are going to be able to, to pre-purchase or is there this kind of like feedback loop built into the design where maybe later on, like sort of like big picture, some of these things start to shift from the way in which people interact with the technology itself?
It's an interesting question, and there's a couple different tendrils there. One is that agriculture is completely a consumer-driven market. So, if everybody demanded that eggs were organic tomorrow in North America, like let's say the 300 million odd people in North America said, I need organic eggs, I'm not going to buy anything else, we'd rapidly see a transition to organic eggs on supermarket. With respect to, making the value flow visible around how many consumers actually would want to eat organic eggs, there's really not a good system to make those wants, demands, and asks visible. A lot of brands do a lot of putting money into tracking what consumers want or what generational differences exist, and there's really not a good methodology for doing that. It's not very accurate, and again, it's food is one of the few things that we can mostly directly control every day. Like we typically choose what we put in our mouths, right? Of course, we have constraints of bioregional availability or what is in the market. With respect to your question around seeing how people self-organize or co-organize, again, because it's a consumer-driven market, which I think that even that phrase might be a little bit too rooted in business. It's really community-driven and rooted in, kind of biocultural knowledge or historical knowledge of how seeds have moved across the world. It's going to be really interesting to see what does happen and what becomes incented from a producer's perspective as a platform. We try to just maintain, it's not necessarily agnosticism around what's on the platform, but it's a tool for producers to be completely transparent and authentic about what they're growing and why, and to connect to people to see what people want to buy or consume. So ultimately, we'd like to create a platform that allows communities to lead with what they want. Because, my experience and mostly, growing up in North America, I'm not going to pretend to know what someone on other continents really need for their communities or demand for their communities. What I do think is that the tools we're creating will help different communities, businesses, brands, help them realize what is demanded. So, for instance, it's $3 to $4 trillion annually is spent on food, and about half of that is done through contract. So an agricultural financial contract means, I'd like to buy 3 years worth of avocados from this farmer. So I'll go into a contractual agreement and say, I'll pay you X amount of money for Y amount of avocados over Z amount of years, let's say 3. Right now, there's not really a standardized way for communities to self-organize those contracts. There's not a good system to, A, create a marketplace, a platform to say, these are all the contracts across the world, across the continent, and B, there's not a way to actually standardize and set those contracts. So one of the core, will go a little bit in technical terms, what we're quite excited about with Holochain is really a contract we can look at as, well, A, it's a social contract or social engagement, but B, from a financial perspective, with a peer-to-peer contract system, and we're incorporating these REA protocols, resource events and agents. There's quite a bit of literature on this. I think there's a Holo happy hour about it. Simply, REA was a system of accounting developed in, the first paper was in 1979, about how accounting will be changed in the computer age. So you can do some quite interesting things with REA. For instance, like double entry bookkeeping. When you place a debit, the credit's automatically generated. Like simple little things. Double entry bookkeeping is over 500 years. And on top of REA, there's a lot of work that has been done to create a framework for creating compositional contracts. So this means that in an REA accounting model, which stands for resource, events, and agents, we can imagine, going back to the avocado example, there's a resource, which is avocados. There are 2 agents, which are the buyer and the seller, and the event is one of the agents saying, I'd like to buy this avocado for X, Y, and Z terms. So right now, there's not a standardized accounting protocol for agricultural producers to network that. So that comes back to the design, and if we provide core framework and tools, we'll see what communities lead with. We'll see what kind of patterns emerge from this fractal sovereignty. There, we found it. Yeah.
And so, with things like the REA accounting method and these patterns, that then opens up, of course, things that get more into the interoperability, like with other currencies that are utilizing these same patterns. We've talked about this before, and so you just want to talk about how. So there's a piece there about the interoperability and how that ecosystem could emerge even from the communities like joining together. But then maybe there's even a further piece to do more with Scepter and the pluggable nature of the technology, where maybe there's different environments around the world which might not have internet access, and they use mesh networks, or they set up their own system in which, yeah, I'm not sure where to go with that, but maybe there's two pieces there about the interoperability with the Holochain patterns, and then the bigger technological pluggable part with Scepter.
Yeah. So, I think that it's a really good context to start with interoperability by looking at Holofuel, right? So Holochain, of course, the first flagship app is Holo, right? This idea that we can back currency by computing power. And it's really genius because I've been trying to think about what is more stable, what is more calculable than computing power, right? We know the supply and demand for computing power because it's quite binary. Let's say you have 10,000 people on a network looking for X amount of computing power. You know how many people are looking for what bandwidth or which bandwidths. With agriculture, it's quite different. Right? With agriculture, we have different crops and commodities that are really dependent upon the climate. And if we look at like how our, something like the futures market in agriculture was created, it was essentially largely because we couldn't even come close to accounting for the amount of wheat being produced in the world. We couldn't, and furthermore, farmers couldn't take their wheat to market themselves. We didn't have like shared distribution patterns. So as far as the currency creation comes from the patterns of producers market, is that we like to think of this contract creation platform as the creation of currencies. By currencies means that a currency would be a value flow of an avocado contract made visible. So instead of futures markets, we can start to have robust forward contracts. And because the pattern is just mutual credit, again, Holochain or Holofuel is like really a cryptographic accounting engine that uses mutual credit to share between agents. And we have something so stable like computing power to use as a base, right? Not static, but stable. There's a breathing supply. We think that the similar patterns will at least start to stabilize a little bit with these interoperable accounting and contract protocols. First started with food, but then you can really, once you start saying, okay, if this is just a framework for resources, events, and agents, it could really be any resource, any agent, organization, company, person, co-op, and any event with that framework. So as soon as we start composing contracts based upon that framework or that grammar, you start to see how basic asset-backed currencies could interoperate because it's using the same frameworks, the same mutual credit systems to trade. Okay, now it's Holofuel with hosting, but then maybe we have an asset-backed currency that's backed by food. And so something that Just One Organics is working on, which is a good partner of the Commons engine, Holochain, the ecosystem in general, is they've developed a gentle freeze-drying method to like really gently dry fruits and vegetables. And they're coming out and working on a currency that's backed by foods. So if we extend this pattern of, and kind of, I really like Scepter, right? Scepter stands for receptor, receptivity, more receptive patterns that actually kind of work around signals. So there's a lot of different signals in agriculture. We can get into like whatever soil anecdotes, but the signals of Holofuel saying hosting, there's X amount of hosting, why people looking for it. Signals of, there's X amount of avocados being grown, Y amount of people looking for it. Using the same patterns of accounting, you can start to see, or one could imagine how these different asset-backed currencies could interoperate, because these are all real commodities by the real world. So you could extend that to be like, okay, well, now we have an energy grid that's backed by real supply and demand. And then we have a housing grid that's backed by real supply and demand. So if we go back to this vision of inverted firms, the real 30,000 foot interoperable view is that all of these peer-to-peer systems are really just communities, and communities of people who need hosting credits, communities of people who grow food, could be communities of people who want to find a house, say Airbnb, communities of people who need a taxi. But right now, all of those systems are incorporated in corporate structures and structures that don't actually lend themselves towards radical collaboration. And if we can get these different services to cooperate and collaborate, we're actually going to be designing a suite of services that outperforms the traditional contemporary market offerings. It's like if you had an app that had Airbnb and Uber connected, so like, oh yeah, I need to take an Uber to go to my Airbnb, right? If you had a community-led or an interoperable ledger that allowed people to share within that ecosystem, you'd soon start to see better services, because they're just going to be more efficient and more affordable and actually more fair. And I guess that's, we can really fractal out from that, but that's kind of what I see the future moving forward, is new patterns of organization around interoperability of these more peer-to-peer humane systems.
Yeah, the reputation systems come to there as mind, which the pattern that's that can be interoperable, and trust can move between different ecosystems and communities and stuff. Maybe one thing that I'd like to maybe just bring into the conversation is the new grammatic capacities. And we're using a whole lot of different terms, and the linguistics of what we're talking about might be a little foreign to some people, but it's, I know this is something that we're trying to talk about more with the use of terms like unencloseable carriers, and how important that is to what we're doing and the Holochain in general. Maybe we could, do you want to just talk a little bit about why you feel grammatic capacity is important into the way in which you understand some of these concepts?
Yeah, I do. I think it's arguably the most important unifier of all these projects. So even the first time I saw Holochain, this is, I don't know, 2 years ago now, I had a pretty hard time. It took me a while to really appreciate its magnificence. It's like, I don't know, the language that is used, like unenclosable carriers or agent-centric, they're different. And for me, I'm always pushing the bar to see how we can make this as inclusive as possible. And this is where I run into some pretty much daily struggle with the constraints of English itself. And we can talk about English as the language of business, and English has built these corporations, or Germanic languages have kind of derived into how we communicate these thoughts. For me, I always feel like I'm just saying so many words to really communicate very core sentiments, oh, be a good person. These are systems to be more kind, to be more receptive, to be more empathetic, to be more open. And ultimately, from a business perspective too, these are just more safe and secure and quicker interactions. Peer-to-peer is quicker when you don't have a middleman company, centralized service or server extracting value. So for me, it's finding the words that can cut to the core very quickly. And it really is a new grammar to surround coordination around. I really like just explaining Holochain as not only a framework for building truly peer-to-peer web apps, but actually a new way for human beings to coordinate. I think that's the best explanation, but then that begets the question. It's like, okay, well, what the heck does that mean? Like, what do you mean? Don't we coordinate fine already? And then so it kind of snowballs into this really, or it could snowball into this really complex discussion about, okay, well, what is this miscoordination or miscommunication happening? Why do the language patterns, the languages of businesses, why have they created ecological or economic conditions that people can't thrive within? So for me, the grammatical capacities come back to design. So I try to push the envelope every day about, okay, so how do we communicate these things? And then how does the design of these patterns become incorporated in interfaces? And really interfaces these days are mostly digital. So in producers market, how do we communicate that this is a much better way for producers, because they can communicate their stories and they're honestly just going to get rewarded more for their work. Or in an app like Instagram, how do we design and viralize these ideas in a way that you don't even really necessarily need words? It's just how it works, or that people get valued for their time. And so a really good tool that I've been using, there's amazing work, it's totally standing on the shoulders of giants, is there's a grammar based upon REA, Resource Events and Agents Counting, called the value flows. Maybe we can include this in the link at the end of the video. It's www.valueflow.ws. And it's really a grammar built upon REA accounting to help distributed economic networks of the future coordinate. And even that is a mouthful, right? So the grammar for me is really looking at what are the intergenerational memes, what are the biocultural words, what other languages, maybe first languages, indigenous languages, have the knowledge that is really lost when we carry the language of business around everywhere. And for me, I'm really kind of tuned into this idea of sound of place. So what are the patterns of grammar or ontologies of grammar that allow us to experience or express a sense of place? And that could be online, that could be virtual, it could be digital. But right now, I think what we're running up against in a business context, in a world economic context, is we're using a language that built a system that doesn't equitably serve people to try to deconstruct that language.
Yeah, it's one of the ways in which I came to Holochain itself was through the exploration of different indigenous and shamanic cultures and the use of natural law, LORE, or universal law language. And something that we're seeing as we start to begin to create these new patterns is holding that vision while at the same time walking in the 3D world, and how these systems and patterns are beginning to evolve and to be created while not being there yet. So it's good to, it feels really good to be able to open up the conversation about the grammatic capacities, and as we ourselves learn it more deeply, then we can share that more widely. Belinda, I know that you quite love this topic, and your use of the English capacity is has been explored deeply, but you have your own troubles with that as well. Did you want to talk a little bit about what you've found from, I know that early on you wrote like a little bit of a guidebook with Holochain and how it all comes together and the language and stuff, and then you also wrote the website Copy for Hum. is there some common threads that you've seen from, the business world and then the new patterns and actually singing that up into the world?
Yeah, so what I'm particularly interested in at the moment is the role of, so we have these new patterns and these new ideas and these new ways of being in the world and with each other that that we want to bring into existence and make real. And I'm interested in the role of story in helping in helping people to come to terms with these new ideas, concepts, patterns, ways of being. Colin, you mentioned story in the context of producers market. Could you maybe give us a sense of how you guys are thinking of the role of story in the ecosystem that you're building?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so we have an in-house digital marketing team that helps producers tell their story. So again, it's for us not being prescriptive about the stories that we might hold or that we've been brought up with or that we're exploring maybe ourselves, but creating a platform for producers to self-describe their own stories. And I think maybe a more overarching story is why do we need to do that right now? What have been the market conditions that have created the climate that we have to make space for producers to self-tell? And so, we own right now, we use a bunch of different Instagram handles to kind of circulate that knowledge. And then also, some in-house photographers to travel to different producers' farms or cooperative communities, who are marketing their goods, or even larger scale, like coconut producers who, are doing good and might not have a method for sharing that. So it's really about, again, kind of being a platform to tell those stories and to provide the tools that people might not have had to tell them before, might not have had the digital marketing firepower, for lack of a better word, that large brands or conglomerates might have. So to kind of put them on an equal footing. And maybe some of these large brands are starting to do really good work. And so how do we, make that visible and authentic? If it's actually really good work, how do we, celebrate that?
Yeah, okay. It seems to me that so I certainly notice in myself a tendency to kind of, I can easily overcomplicate the idea of storytelling, like, and kind of, I can think about it as something that needs to be kind of formalized and systematized, and that we need a framework for. And it sounds like what you're saying is that storytelling can be as simple as a series of pictures, a few words, and a platform to distribute the pictures and the words to people who are interested in it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, have I got that right? Or, I mean, I'm interested in your thoughts about that. Like, what's the infrastructure that we need in order to be able to tell really good stories?
Yeah. Well, one thing. So I think two things. One is that some of the best stories are not written down. Kind of the same thing that we were talking about is that, even how we're taught about oral tradition, and at least my experience in my schools in North America, well, not all of them, Not with some teachers, but generally I think, at least how I've seen it written in most history books, is that oral tradition was like an obtuse, like an arcane, old, antiquated way of telling stories that was like far less superior than writing it down. Right? Right? Would you agree with that? Is how you read it in history?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oral traditions are often primitive, right?
Right, exactly. And so I think some of the best things aren't written down and can't be written down. And that's kind of been a thing for me. I think, Nick, going back to your question about grammatic capacities, is what do we lean on as communicators or even in our systems to tell stories? For a granular point is that with producers, it's like, okay, we have a platform and there's one avocado in this hand and another avocado in this hand. Let's say this avocado tells you everything about the avocado. It's $1. You can buy it. Or this avocado tells you nothing, but it's $1. Which one are you going to buy? Which story teaches you more, tells you more? So I think your assessment, Linda, was right. That's just the platform. And then again, letting people self-ascribe their own stories, I think, is super powerful, and why these agent-centric models are just inherently better, because if we can create systems where people can tell stories in their own ways, opposed to us coding a form that they have to play within, that becomes really, really amazing. And I think that's what many of us are circling around in this ecosystem.
And there's a couple of different kind of layers of storytelling here, right? So one of them is, to use the producers market context, right? There's the kind of the backstory of a producer, right? Who they are, grower, who they are, where they live, what they grow, how they grow it, and why they're doing it, right? And then there's the story. Then there's a story or multiple stories that you can stitch together using the base technological capabilities in the Holochain platform that allows us to collect data at different points in a flow of value, like in a value chain. And so there's some really interesting and potentially pretty new and possibly unique abilities to construct or to make visible stories that are kind of automatically brought to the surface, that don't necessarily need to be told by an actor or an agent, that we can tell just by kind of representing data.
Yeah, and yes, completely. And the counting systems for that are really what's being, I think, created here, and how those, simply like the creation of something we're creating is like a peer-to-peer market maker, right? So if you have any commodity that you wish to list for sale or trade or barter or whatever, you can do that. And it's also tied to this suite of services or this accounting model, this RA accounting model that allows you to transact with another agent and automatically fractalize that story, because going all the way back with an avocado, sure, the resource is the avocado, but there are many different resources to go into that avocado: sun, compost, seeds, hands, human attention, lots of energy, a whole and then of course it's nested in an ecosystem. Like maybe it's grown in the Michoacan in southwest central Mexico. That is a whole community of people that have been there for thousands of years, and that market is all fractally connected to your local grocery store? Or, what's the incentive of keeping that avocado close? Or, an oil reserve that's in the Amazon. It's like this, these are stories that now we do, to your point, have a better systems to account for that exchange. So there's really a couple factors that people are excited about, just with, if people are talking about distributed ledger technology and they're like, oh, the transactions are so quick, so many transactions per second. It's not just about the transactions per second. You can think of it more of like stories per second, because with every transaction could be a story instead of just like a negative speculative boom that we've seen be supported. So it's more about I think the context, opposed to just being, oh yeah, we're going to build the fastest peer-to-peer exchange market maker in the world. We've never been able to trade faster, but it's like, well, we're still limited by constraints. And so what's the speed at which we can share and fractalize and exponentially share what we've learned or not, I think is a really promising use and a promising outcome, byproduct, or maybe base for I really like that, the idea of fractal sovereignty of these inverted firms. So every agent is a sovereign agent with their sovereign identity, and they can engage in fractals with all these different groups because they're all interoperable if they're all built upon similar patterns.
In a way, there is so much more than just the product behind the product. It's also the human story and the intention of the people who are creating that product, no matter what it is. And there is something with distributed ledger technology that many people think is about the anonymity, being anonymous, but actually it's about the transparency and the truthfulness. It's possible to make sure that you go and buy a product. You associate with the producer what the intention is, the community, where the money flow goes. There's so much more than just a product. It's the human story behind it is so much more important than the actual product, maybe even the quality of it. Where does it come from? And this is something which I think what we are all trying to build here is most important.
Yeah, I think what you just said is really important. And for me, a lot of these conversations about privacy and anonymity, privacy isn't really about secrecy, it's about control, right? And there are some instances where that control is super important to have, or I'd argue most, actually every engagement, it's important to have control over when you can be candid and not. And that it's also a unique privilege to be anonymous or not be anonymous, or have the option to be, interestingly. So that's definitely what I think all this technology is stepped towards. And that's, I think, a larger conversation nested in more receptive and empathetic technologies that these larger structures really pattern themselves within. I think what you said is super important. It just gives choice, right? I think the idea of maybe you're supporting someone because their intention is in alignment with yours, opposed to just being the cheapest thing, and whatever cheap means anymore. But I mean, we also, I try to balance all these things with, we have real market demands and real economic worries right now, like accelerating income inequality, wealth concentration at world record highs. So how do we balance these alternative structures with real solutions that, if I'm working to feed my family, how I can do that in a way that's more harmonious with other systems, right? And I think that really trickles down into stuff that Hum is working on too, right? If it's even the access to information is guarded by the same patterns that I'm describing through producers or the larger theme. And the number of times that I would pay, I go to whatever, an online news site that is a subscription model. If I could just pay the producer directly, it's like, I don't see a lot of information because of payment gates, unfortunately. And it's pretty much the same thing about the stories around food too. Like, people can't access good stories and really good food right now because it's guarded by a higher price. I'd argue inequitably, these foods that aren't sprayed with dangerous chemicals and pesticides are what's available. And it's really the story. The story is locked up and not told. So it's a whole educational component too. But that's really the more intense theme, and really I see the barrier of I don't see it really as a barrier. I just see it as a something to be moved. Mm-hmm. So maybe a barrier.
About shifting the value from simply what is cheap or expensive or trendy to real human values of basically value. Where does it come from? How it's been produced? From who it's been produced? Where the money flow goes to, instead of just price? Because nowadays, or a label, even something like organic, I come from I live in the European Union, and it's like I had a mate who was producing pure organic food from his own land and had from the land of his parents, but he was not able to get the license that is organic. It was just pure madness. There's so much more than just the labels. We're paying money, we're paying for, and it's about
Yeah, and it's an interesting invocation of the organic label. The organic label is the only eco label that is enforced by government and private institutions. And it's really a currency, right? Certification is a currency. People will buy the organic products because it says organic, and they can buy it with, it's also one of the only labels where people self-elect to be more regulated. And of course it's expensive, and there's a bunch of issues. It's expensive, and you can still use chemicals in organic. People are just buying in with the notion that maybe these, there's a chance that these foods are better for people and planet, which, most of the times I'd argue they are. But to your point, the currency is not rooted in a simple truth of, objectively how are people being treated to produce this food, or what's the agency of people that's being extracted or exploited. What's the code where people aren't exploiting themselves or others to get a product to market. And I'd argue the organic label is a step towards that, but of course it's highly imperfect, and just an interesting use case around. One interesting thing about the organic industry is we don't actually know how many organic acres are in the world. They actually don't take that data. So there's one of the largest databases. There's some things, and it's what is conventional now is these are all, again, we're seeing a huge wave of consciousness shift around, and largely because of these tools, or partially because of these tools of transparency, that people are demanding that they know where their food comes from. I mean, if you look at even just like savvy business people will be getting into the organic market right now because that's what people are demanding. And I think this kind of dovetails an interesting point, is that there's more, there's alternative certification models that are like peer-to-peer certified. So you can have like a community of agriculturalists in a region creating a system of metrics Maybe they think that their certification is better than organic because maybe they, only use super biodiverse seeds, great variety. Maybe they, use, something like permaculture practices or traditional ecological knowledge. And they could say, okay, we're going to, a strong group of whatever, 10 or 100,000 people could say, all right, these are our standards of our organic certification, our certification, our peer certification, and that we can then agree to self-enforce and enforce one another to adhere to our standards. So then you can start to get these different bioregional specific specifications that go beyond this blanket cert. That again, I think I see a lot of these as just bridges, right? Bridges to the next better system.
I think we're coming also back to the point of reputation, and anyway, reputation is mostly government, or let's say if you have a business on Amazon, it's issued by them, but we talk about here something new, which is more like reputation based on creating relationships on human to human level and related to people, and not simply because there is such a label issued by the government or whatever, some corporation, but more based on relationship.
Yeah.
And then that will create, certain reputation to the producer or to the trader or to the market or to the business by simply creating a real human to human relationship. And this is very different than just certificational level.
Yeah, well said. Yeah.
And also when you add the transparency and being able to trace the past relationship of certain producers, something, and then it's fascinating.
Points that everyone's been discussing here in relation to the human to human value, like the deepening relationships, storytelling, the building of the communities, the connection and interoperability between those communities, how they all feed into each other. And so with the tools and the flows of value, which are now possible with the Holochain and the tools that producers are building, people are able to connect to each other through these flows of value that they now see, and these stories that are being told, and allow those producers or those agents or those communities to begin to self-organize and create that demand because they're aware of what they actually want. And that seems like a beautiful upward spiral in there, like piecing together all of these different points that we're all talking about.
Agreed.
Do you guys have some other stuff that you'd like to talk about, or are we happy to leave it on the upward spiral?
I have a question. As being the only one here who never really met you, Colin, and it's really fascinating I'm really happy that you joined us on this podcast.
Thank you.
Maybe you can touch a little bit and we talk about stories, a little bit about your story. I mean, how did you end up doing what you're doing, and how did you found Holochain, and why did you decide it? And I mean, not just you, but the people you work with to be doing what you're doing right now. I think this will be very interesting for the people who are listening to this podcast.
Yeah. I guess, I grew up in a place that is, right by a volcano called Colin, Mount Baker. And, it holds the world record for snowfall. used to be the largest salmon run in the whole world. So all the salmon from Alaska, all up the North Pacific would swim down to spawn, for like 10,000 years. This area, kind of Seattle, Vancouver area, was all under glaciers until like about 15,000 years ago. So the history's pretty new. Like, people haven't really been here for very long. And I grew up kind of like on the right where all the salmon used to swim by. And when European settlers came in the late 19th century, they ended up terraforming the whole river estuary. So they turned it into agriculture. And so I grew up in a completely beautiful spot, like filled with just like incredible, natural beauty, and pretty close to the water and land, and amazing seafood and fishing, and berries, like a ton of berries. And I grew up super interested in agriculture and science and history, and I didn't really understand the context of where I grew up in the history of, what I consider my home, until I started putting the pieces together around that, like, a couple hundred years ago, you would have never had to work. Like, even the concept of work had only existed in this part of the world for like 150 years. Like, it was some of the most recently colonized place in the whole world. And through a lot of listening and reflection, I realized that really the way that we view the economy, and how we eat and clothe and feed ourselves is really quite broken, I think. And even the territory, like, I grew up in Washington State. The territory of Washington State's only been around since like 1889. So I grew up in a lot of just in a basically a hotbed, and because of a lot of incredible elders and mentors in my life, I've started really realizing what it was here, and really the stories that weren't told. And so I really got into like producers and really technology, actually through agriculture. So I was farming grains in Southwest Washington State, and I couldn't find a really small amount of organic seeds, very small, like only about, well, not very small, but a ton. So I was only planting about 20 acres or so. And I realized that there's no way to connect agricultural buyers and sellers directly over the internet, just over seeds. So I started a company to build a platform to connect like seeds people. And before that, I'd become pretty interested in different distributed ledger technologies. I got connected to the founders of Hashgraph. So it's a few years ago now. And, I had kind of run through the studies. I studied genetics and economics and kind of markets and computer science in undergrad. I started looking at Hashgraph and then realizing that maybe it wasn't the perfect fit for like a truly peer-to-peer seed exchange. And then actually ran into someone who works for Holochain in the back of a cafe in Berkeley. And I overheard that they're well, I'd heard about Holochain like 8 months prior, but then I heard some people having like a pretty fervent discussion about consensus. And I was like, what are you guys talking about consensus about? And then I I politely butted into the conversation, and then got tuned into Holochain, again, reminded about Holochain, and then started looking at the code and realizing that, and then I read Arthur Brock's page about Holochain versus Hashgraph and when consensus is needed in distributed computing, and kind of had a eureka moment around like, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. And then, so that company that's building that initial seed making tool was still formulating that, and then market making tool. And then I got connected to producers through a friend of friend. And then we realized we were just super, like instant friends, and realized that we were working on the same vision. And I read the producer's market white paper. And when you see something that you've been thinking about, but haven't written down yourself, you're, usually gravitated towards it. And then from there on after, I always knew that this peer-to-peer market maker could be used for any commodity. Didn't need to be just seeds. It could be anything, right? Any currency. And now it's just this like weird network effect of, like crazy network economists and like researchers and thought leaders who I've realized have concurrently all been thinking about this stuff that I have. This inverted firms idea comes from this really brilliant researcher named Marshall Ben Eisting. Can't remember. I might be butchering his name. You type in Marshall MIT. So I'm realizing that this is just a hotbed issue around platform economics and network economics. So now it's just kind of upward spiraled into, oh my goodness, this is such a iterative theme right now that can be carried to every single different industry in the world right now. So, yeah, I guess it's, through a story. It's how I got connected. Some nice story. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
It's really,
say it again?
It's the beautiful story, and it's interesting some of these themes that pop up. Like we were looking at food stuff ourselves, and we stumbled across Holochain, and I've been studying some of the ancient techniques of seed saving and seed banks and activating seeds from some of these indigenous cultures, and that's sort of where you got started as well, within the seed part. So as we close this off, and we've been telling the story about, or we've been sharing our story of increased grammatic capacities. From what you've learned about Holochain and from being deep in the weeds and this being a community podcast, what would you like to leave with? Would you like to share anything about how you feel the community itself could help continue the story of these new grammatic capacities or Holochain in general? Are there some things that you've seen from deep in the weeds that you'd like to see for yourself in the community that, it doesn't have to be anything big, just some simple things of how this could grow?
Yeah, I think that there's a huge potential right now to imagine, design, architect, play with what more peer-to-peer systems will look like. And that comes from really simply like what all of these applications that we engage with every day are going to change. That is without a doubt going to happen. We're going to see more in all the story and cultural stuff aside, just from a perspective of speed and security, these systems are better. And the way we share resources, or it's easier to share resources when, well, it could be, I'm not going to say it is or isn't, but there's a huge potential for the sharing of resources and supporting of people to be streamlined. So for me, it's helping the community and ourselves create words, stories that are accessible to all people. And I'm really focused on the next generation, like Gen Z and Gen Alpha, because we are at a key inflection point where the internet is dominated by people who are using our attention to sell us rubbish. And we need to buck that trend to, I'm confident that this needs to happen. We need to buck that trend if we really want to solve the climate crisis or the economic crisis that we're in. So for me, it's also an incredible business opportunity to think about, okay, pick your favorite mobile app right now. What would it look like if it were peer-to-peer? If there wasn't a centralized corporation there? What's the new cooperative model that allows us to do that, and how do we communicate that in a way that is sensitive and from the heart and viable? And that's, I'm open to hearing anything and helping craft those ideas right now, because it's very important. And we really don't have that much time to really, there's conscious growth, of course, but we're at this inflection point where we need to deliver on that now, or yesterday, or 10 years ago. Right? And that's really the kind of call to action, is imagine what you like doing and how could it be done better, especially through it doesn't even have to be digital, but how could a better coordination tool that helps move resources, capital, art better. I think that's really where we're at right now with all of these things.
Intention is the new attention.
Nice. Love that.
So if anyone would like to reach out to you or connect, do you want to share where you're at?
Yeah, you can send me an email at colin@producersmarket.com. That's probably the best way to reach me.
We will add it to the description below the video.
Great. Perfect.
Thanks so much for coming and joining us on Fractal Sovereignty, Colin. It's been a really fantastic opportunity for all of us to get to know you, and I feel like you're someone that really gets it on a deep level, and just in the short time that we've gotten to know each other, it feels that this feels really good to connect on this stuff, and behind it all, the intention and just to be able to share with you on this journey. So I look forward to meeting up with you in person soon, and good to be on the ride with you, brother.
Likewise, Nick. Likewise.
Yeah. All right, guys. So we'll see you shortly for the next episode, and thanks again, Colin. Peace out.
Thanks, you all. Yeah, cheers.